Today we got some more actual history about Daniel Boone from this book, Historical Sketches of Kentucky by Lewis Collins. This book was published all the way back in 1848. We'll read about the capture of Daniel Boone's daughter, and then we'll read about the capture of Boone himself along with about 26 other men who were harvesting salt from the Blue Licks in February of 1778. Then we'll read about the Great Siege of Boonesborough that occurred later that year. This book doesn't tell much about the fate of the salt workers who were captured along with Boone, so I'll be reading from this article from the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society that was published by William Dodd Brown in 1985. It is titled, The Capture of Boone's Saltmakers, Fresh Perspectives from Primary Sources. In the summer of 1775, after the completion of the fort at Boonesborough, Daniel Boone returned to Clinch River for his family. He brought them to the new fort as soon as the journey could be performed, and Mrs. Boone and her daughters were the first white women who ever stood upon the banks of the Kentucky River. They were soon reinforced by the arrival of 3 more families, at the head of which were Mrs. McGarry, Mrs. Hogan, and Mrs. Denton. Boonesborough soon became the central object of Indian hostilities. On the 24th of September, 1775, the garrison was suddenly attacked by a party of Indians, and one of the number killed. On the 7th of July, 1776, a much more alarming incident occurred. A daughter of Daniel Boone, in company with Miss Betsy and Miss Frances Calloway, the first and last named about 13 years of age, the other Miss Betsy grown, while amusing themselves in a canoe, were captured by a party of Indians in sight of the fort. The screams of the terrified girls quickly alarmed the families in the garrison, but as it was near nightfall and the canoe on the opposite side of the river, pursuit was not commenced in time to follow more than 5 miles during the night. By daylight next morning, a party consisting of Daniel Boone, Colonel Floyd, and 6 others got upon their track and continued the pursuit. The exceeding caution of the Indians rendered it difficult for the pursuing party to keep on their trail, but notwithstanding they pressed forward in the direction they supposed the Indians would take, with almost incredible rapidity. Having traveled about 35 miles, they struck a buffalo trace, where they found the tracks quite plain. The pursuit was urged on with great keenness, and at the further distance of 10 miles they came in sight of the Indians, just as they were kindling a fire to cook. Both parties saw each other at the same instant. 4 of the whites fired, and then charged so suddenly and furiously upon the Indians that they were compelled to retreat with a single shotgun without ammunition, and without time to tomahawk their captives. The girls sustained no other injury than excessive fright and fatigue. 2 of the Indians were killed. The party were so much elated with the recovery of the frightened and jaded little girls that they did not pursue the Indians, but immediately retraced their steps, and safely arrived at Boonesborough on the succeeding day. From this time until the 15th of April the following year, the garrison was constantly harassed by flying parties of Indians. They were kept in continual anxiety and alarm, and the most ordinary duties could only be performed at the risk of their lives. While plowing their corn, they were waylaid and shot. While hunting, they were pursued and fired upon, and sometimes a solitary Indian would creep up near the fort during the night and fire upon the first of the garrison who appeared in the morning. On the 15th of April, a large body of Indians invested the fort, hoping to crush the settlement at a single blow, but destitute as they were of scaling ladders and all the proper means of reducing fortified places, they could only annoy the garrison and destroy the property, and being more exposed than the whites, they soon retired precipitately. On the 4th of July, 1777, they again appeared with a force of 200 warriors, and were repulsed with loss. A short period of tranquility was now allowed to the harassed and distressed garrison, but this was soon followed by the most severe calamity that had yet befallen the infant settlement. This was the capture of Boone and 27 of his men in the month of January 1778 at the Blue Licks, whither he had gone to make salts for a garrison. He was carried to the old town of Chillicothe, in the present state of Ohio, where he remained a prisoner with the Indians until the 16th of the following June, when he contrived to make his escape and return to Boonesborough. During this period, Boone kept no journal, and we are therefore uninformed as to any of the particular incidents which occurred during his captivity. We only know, generally, that by his equanimity, his patience, his seeming cheerful submission to the fortune which had made him a captive, and his remarkable skill and expertness as a woodsman, he succeeded in powerfully exciting the admiration and conciliating the goodwill of his captors. In March 1778, he accompanied the Indians on a visit to Detroit, where Governor Hamilton offered £100 for his ransom, but so strong was the affection of the Indians for their prisoner that it was unhesitatingly refused. Several English gentlemen, touched with sympathy for his misfortunes, made pressing offers of money and other articles, but Boone steadily refused to receive benefits which he could never return. On his return from Detroit, he observed that large numbers of warriors had assembled, painted and equipped for an expedition against Boonesborough, and his anxiety became so great that he determined to effect his escape at every hazard. During the whole of this agitating period, however, he permitted no symptom of anxiety to escape, but continued to hunt and shoot with the Indians as usual, until the morning of the 16th of June, when making an early start he left Chillicothe, and shaped his course for Boonesborough. This journey, exceeding a distance of 150 miles, he performed in 4 days, during which he ate only one meal. He was received at the garrison like one risen from the dead. His family, supposing him killed, had returned to North Carolina, and his men, apprehending no danger, had permitted the defenses of the fort to fall to decay. The danger was imminent. The enemy were hourly expected, and the fort was in no condition to receive them. Not a moment was to be lost. The garrison worked night and day, and by indefatigable diligence, everything was made ready within 10 days after his arrival, for the approach of the enemy. At this time, one of his companions arrived from Chillicothe, and reported that his escape had determined the Indians to delay the invasion for 3 weeks. The attack was delayed so long that Boone, in his turn, resolved to invade the Indian country, and accordingly, at the head of a select company of 19 men, he marched against the town of Paint Creek, on the Scioto River, within 4 miles of which he arrived without discovery. Here he encountered a party of 30 warriors on their march to join the Grand Army in its expedition against Boonesborough. This party he attacked and routed without injury or loss to himself, and ascertaining that the main body of the Indians were on their march to Boonesborough, he retraced his steps for that place with all possible expedition. He passed the Indians on the 6th day of their march, and on the 7th reached the fort. The next day the Indians appeared in great force, numbering at least 500 warriors armed and painted in their usual manner. They were conducted by Canadian officers well skilled in the usages of modern warfare. As soon as they were arrayed in front of the fort, the British colors were displayed, and an officer with a flag was sent to demand the surrender of the fort, with a promise of quarter and good treatment in case of compliance, and threatening the hatchet in case of a storm. Boone requested 2 days for consideration, which in defiance of all experience and common sense was granted. This interval, as usual, was employed in preparation for an obstinate resistance. The cattle were brought into the fort, the horses secured, and all things made ready against the commencement of hostilities. Boone then assembled the garrison, and represented to them the condition in which they stood. They had not now to deal with Indians alone, but with British officers skilled in the art of attacking fortified places, sufficiently numerous to direct, but too few to restrain their Indian allies. If they surrendered, their lives might and probably would be saved, but they would suffer much inconvenience, and must lose all their property. If they resisted and were overcome, the life of every man, woman, and child would be sacrificed. The hour was now come in which they were to determine what was to be done. If they were inclined to surrender, he would announce it to the officer. If they were resolved to maintain the fort, he would share their fate, whether in life or death. He had scarcely finished when every man arose, and in a firm tone announced his determination to defend the fort to the last. Boone then appeared at the gate of the fortress and communicated to Captain Duquesne the resolution of his men. Disappointment and chagrin were strongly painted upon the face of the Canadian at this answer, but endeavoring to disguise his feelings, he declared that Governor Hamilton had ordered him not to injure the men if it could be avoided, and that if 9 of the principal inhabitants of the fort would come out into the plain and treat with them, they would instantly depart without further hostility. The insidious nature of this proposal was evident, for they could converse very well from where they then stood, and going out would only place the officers of the fort at the mercy of the Indians, not to mention the absurdity of supposing that this army of warriors would treat, but upon such terms as pleased them, and no terms were likely to do so short of a total abandonment of the country. Notwithstanding these obvious objections, the word treat sounded so pleasantly in the ears of the besieged that they agreed at once to the proposal, and Boone himself, attended by 8 of his men, went out and mingled with the Indians, who crowded around them in great numbers, and with countenances of deep anxiety. The treaty then commenced and was soon concluded. What the terms were we are not informed, nor is it a matter of the least importance, as the whole was a stupid and shallow artifice. This was soon made manifest. Duquesne, after very many pretty periods about the bienfaisance et humanitae which should accompany the warfare of civilized beings, at length informed Boone that it was a custom with the Indians upon the conclusion of a treaty with the whites, for 2 warriors to take hold of the hand of each white man. Boone thought this rather a singular custom, but there was no time to dispute about etiquette, particularly as he could not be more in their power than he already was, so he signified his willingness to conform to the Indian mode of cementing friendship. Instantly 2 warriors approached each white man, with the word brother upon their lips, but a very different expression in their eyes, and grappling him with violence attempted to bear him off. Boone's party probably expected such a consummation, and all at the same moment sprung from their enemies and ran to the fort, under a heavy fire, which fortunately wounded only 1 man. The attack instantly commenced by a heavy fire against the picketing, and was returned with fatal accuracy by the garrison. The Indians quickly sheltered themselves, and the action became more cautious and deliberate. Finding but little effect from the fire of his men, Duquesne next resorted to a more formidable mode of attack. The fort stood on the south bank of the river, within 60 yards of the water. Commencing under the bank where their operations were concealed from the garrison, they attempted to push a mine into the fort. Their object, however, was fortunately discovered by the quantity of fresh earth which they were compelled to throw into the river, and by which the water became muddy from some distance below. Boone, who had regained his usual sagacity, instantly cut a trench within the fort, in such a manner as to intersect the line of their approach, and thus frustrating their design. The enemy exhausted all the ordinary artifices of Indian warfare, but were steadily repulsed in every effort. Finding their numbers daily thinned by the deliberate but fatal fire of the garrison, and seeing no prospect of final success, they broke up on the 9th day of the siege and returned home. The loss of the garrison was 2 men killed and 4 wounded. On the part of the Indians, 37 were killed, and many wounded, who as usual were all carried off. This was the last siege sustained by Boonesborough. The country had increased so rapidly in numbers, and so many other stations lay between Boonesborough and the Ohio, that the Indians could not reach it without leaving enemies in the rear. So that's the story of Boone's capture and escape from the Shawnees, and the last siege of Boonesborough, which occurred in 1778. One thing this story left out is the fate of the salt workers, who were captured along with Boone but did not escape with him. For that, I will now read from this article published in 1985 by William Dodd Brown in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, titled The Capture of Daniel Boone's Saltmakers, Fresh Perspectives from Primary Sources. One of the best-known stories in Kentucky pioneer history is the capture of Daniel Boone and the salt-making party at the Blue Licks. Any general history of the Commonwealth is certain to contain an account of the founding of Boonesborough, the capture of Boone and the salt-makers, and the siege of the fort by the Indians. Yet, as well known as this story is, there is much about the capture that remains unknown and obscure. Exactly how many were taken prisoner with Boone? What were their names? What happened to these men? Did any ever escape and return to Kentucky? Most historians are silent as to the fate of the saltmakers. A few writers of Kentucky history make vague references to the saltmakers being sent to Detroit. One of the most detailed accounts of the capture, however, can be found in William Stewart Lester's The Transylvania Colony. In this work, Dr. Lester states that after the captives had reached the Indian town of Little Chillicothe, Boone and 16 others were adopted into the tribe. Then, about 3 weeks later, 10 prisoners who had not been adopted were taken by the Shawnee to Detroit for the purpose of getting the bounty promised by Henry Hamilton, the British lieutenant governor. Hamilton had promised the Indians 20 pounds for every well and sound prisoner delivered to him. Lester's study sheds a good deal of light on the fate of the saltmakers, but it still leaves a number of questions unanswered. Did the men adopted into the tribe escape and return to the frontier settlements? Did the men sent to Detroit remain prisoners of the British for the entire length of the war? What happened to the saltmakers? For some, we will never know, but for the 6 men who lived long lives and filed Revolutionary War pension applications, we have detailed first-hand accounts of their capture and subsequent return. Ansel Goodman. On this, the 29th day of October, 1832, personally appeared in open court, it being a court of record sitting and for the county aforesaid, Russell County, Kentucky. Ansel Goodman, resident of said county, aged about 80 years, who being first duly sworn according to law doth on his oath make the following declaration, that in the state of Virginia and the county of Bedford, in the year as well as he can now remember of 1777, he enlisted in the service of the United States under Captain Charles Watkins, and was ordered to Kentucky with the balance of the company for the purpose of assisting the inhabitants in their battles against the British and Indians, that the company was composed of 50-odd men, that they were promised 40 shillings per month, and the period of their enlistment was for 6 months. That very soon after their enlistment they were marched to Kentucky by their captain and arrived at Boonesborough on the Kentucky River, at which place we found Colonel Daniel Boone and some men and families under his command. We were placed under the command also of Colonel Boone, and acted in the capacity of defenders of the fort against the enemy, and also as Indian spies. Some considerable time after being so employed upon constant duty and very short allowance, himself and as well as he can now recollect about 30 others under the command of Colonel Boone were ordered out upon an expedition to make salts for the use of those in the fort. They marched to a place about 70 or 80 miles from the fort, then and now known and called the Blue Licks. After being there for about 3 weeks engaged in making salt, Colonel Boone was absent from the company hunting and trapping, when a party of the Shawnees of about 100 Indians, commanded by their chief Blackfish, fired several guns at him, and ran him some distance, and he, Boone, discovering he would be taken, stopped, put his gun behind a tree, stepped out, and gave up. The Indians then marched with Colonel Boone to where the balance of us were, and we were ordered by Colonel Boone to stack our guns and surrender. We did so. They were all taken first to the Indian towns over the Ohio River, on the Little Miami. Some of the company were taken to the British. Ansel Goodman and a few others were retained by the Indians, and from the day he was taken up to the time he ran off, a period of 8 months, he suffered misery and wretchedness, hunger, cruelty, and oppression of almost every sort. The night after he was taken, his arms were tied behind him, a rope or buffalo tug tied fast around his middle, and then made fast to an Indian on each side of him. The one around his arms was made to go around his neck, and tied fast to a tree, and in that position he had to sleep upon the snow. A little while before he reached the Indian town, he was compelled to strip himself, cold as it was, entirely naked, his arms again made fast, and a load of bear meat packed upon him. It was a heavy load. Indeed, he was packed heavily from the time he was taken until he arrived at the town, and just as he got there, he was met by many Indians from the town, and forced to run the gauntlet with the load of meat, and was severely beaten and bruised in the race. After running the gauntlet, he and other prisoners were ordered to dance like the whites. A black man who was prisoner with them acted as interpreter. Goodman having stayed as he before mentioned 8 months, he in company with 2 others, George Hendricks and Aaron Furman, ran away, and having learnt from some of the Indians before they started that there was some white men at the falls of the Ohio, they made their course that way. Before they arrived there, being pressed with hunger, they were getting some red haws when a party of Indians came upon them, and after a chase retook George Hendricks, but his other companion and himself arrived safely at the falls. Another salt maker kept by the Shawnee was Micajah Calloway. However, Calloway was not fortunate enough to escape, and he remained under Indian domination for over 5 years. Here is his narrative. He entered the service as a volunteer in Beaudecourt County, Virginia, by joining a company under Captain Henry Paulding of the Virginia Militia. This was in the month of April 1777. The company consisted of about 100 men. Immediately after joining the company, he marched with Paulding to Boonesborough. There he served under Paulding for about 9 months. He then volunteered under Colonel Boone, and in February of 1778 he was stationed at the Blue Licks with others making salt, and whilst there he was taken with 26 others, Colonel Boone among the number, by a company of Shawnee Indians of upwards of 100. James Calloway, Jesse Cooper, Nathaniel Bullock, John Hawley, William Brooks, and Samuel Brooks were among the number of prisoners. He remained a prisoner of the Shawnees from that time for 5 years and 5 months, during which time he moved to different places in Ohio. After the tribe was driven from the Little Miami by a party from Kentucky, it took its station on Mad River and remained there for about 1 year. Then the tribe moved up to the Big Miami River about 20 miles, remained there some time, then moved to a small stream emptying into the Miami. From that place the tribe was driven by a party under General George Rogers Clark, with 7 of the Indians being there taken prisoners, the queen of the nation being among the number. Her name was Lamatuinque. The tribe then took their station on St. Mary's River, and remained there for about 3 months. He was then employed as an interpreter on behalf of the Shawnees to go to the falls of the Ohio River to treat on the subject of the exchange of prisoners. 7 Indians went with him to that place for that purpose. The exchange took place after he had been there for about 7 days. General Clark being there at that time, by whose assistance this declarant was released at that time. A third salt maker adopted by the Shawnee was Joseph Jackson. In his narrative, Jackson was less than honest when he said that he was released from captivity in 1783, and that he stayed with some British traders for a time. The truth is that he remained with the Indians. In an interview with Dr. Lyman C. Draper, he told of incidents concerning the tribe that took place in the 1790s. Dr. Draper was convinced that over the years Jackson had become in every sense an Indian, and had fought against Harmar, St. Clair, and General Wayne. Jackson, however, denied that he ever fought against the whites. He returned to Kentucky in 1800, married, and lived for a time in Madison County. He states that after being released from captivity in 1783, as above stated, he remained some time among the British traders, and had no regular place of residence until about the year 1800, when he settled in Madison County, Kentucky. Andrew Johnson was the first to escape from the Indians. He acted like a half-wit, and being very small in size, Johnson had the Indians wondering if he was a small man or a large boy. When they gave him a gun to shoot, Johnson would pretend to be afraid of it. At the sound of the gun going off, he would wince in terror and miss his target completely. The Indians gave him the name of Pequawly, which means little shut his eyes. Thinking him a fool, the Indians did not watch him as closely as the others, and this was how Johnson made his escape. The following account comes from a long interview with pioneer Josiah Collins, which is presently part of the Draper collection of manuscripts. Collins was a good friend and hunting companion of Johnson's, and he heard this story from Johnson himself. Andrew Johnson, a very small man, was taken prisoner at the lower Blue Licks with Colonel Boone in February of 1778, and escaped about the 1st of June following from Chillicothe. Previous to his escape, the Indians would set up a mark and try him if he could shoot. In order to deceive them, he would miss their tree. They concluded from his small size that he hadn't his full growth, therefore hadn't learned to shoot. They would call him by his Indian name, Pequawly, which way Kentuck? He would point a different course. They would then look at each other and laugh, thinking him a mere infant. His adopted Indian father came to Kentucky to steal horses, and in his father's absence he and his Indian brother had a fight. He, proving too strong, put the family all in fear of him. When his father returned, the first that was told of him was that Pequawly had fought his brother. His father gave him a great reprimand for fighting his brother in his absence, and threatened to sell him for his bad behavior. That night was to be a great war dance, the warriors having returned home. His father, to punish him, told him to go to bed with the children. He shouldn't go to the dance. Pequawly went to his bed as ordered, but some time after rose up and went out to the dance. His father asked him what business he had there. He replied he wanted to dance. His father told him to take a dance, go home, and not to come back. He did so, took his father's gun, tomahawk, knife, powder, and lead, blanket coat, etc., and escaped. He rafted the Ohio River and came safe into Harrodsburg, Kentucky. After Pequawly had escaped from Chillicothe, they hunted 3 days for his track, without success, and grieved therefore very much, saying, Pequawly, poor little fool, couldn't shoot and didn't know the way to Kentuck, and he would die in the woods. His father also very much regretted that he had given him the reprimand, for he knew that that was what had started him. The Indians then went to Daniel Boone and said, Boone, think Pequawly find the way to Kentuck? Boone said, I don't know. Johnson stayed at Harrodsburg for about 2 weeks, then took 4 men with him and went back on an expedition to Chillicothe. About 10 miles on this side of the Indian town, they heard bells open late in the evening near them. They secreted themselves till some time in the night, caught the Indian horses and tied them. Then they crept up near the Indian camp, fired in on them, and killed 2. Captain Blackfish, being one of the Indian party, cried out, Hoy, hoy, Shawnees, we are Shawnees! But as Pequawly's company kept up the fire, Blackfish and his men made their escape and went into Chillicothe. Blackfish told Boone the circumstances, and he suspected that it was some other tribe of Indians that had come on to them to war. He raised what Indian men he could and returned back to camp, found 2 Indians dead and the horses gone. He then returned home and told Boone that he could not tell who had done it. About that time, an Indian got wounded at Boonesborough, and the Indians packed him along till they got him across the Ohio River. Then they left him to get a horse to take him on. In their absence, Pequawly passed by. The Indian there knew Pequawly and saw him. When the Indians returned to take him home, he told them that he had seen Pequawly and some more of the Long Knives with horses pass by. They returned and told Boone that Pequawly was a little man, but a great rogue. William Tracy's experiences were a little different from the rest. He was kept by the Indians for many years, and then taken to Detroit and sold. Eventually he obtained his release from the British. From Tracy's pension records comes the following account. In February of 1778, at the Big Blue Licks in Kentucky, he was with 20-odd others, taken prisoner by the Indians. Colonel Boone was taken prisoner the day before them. We were at the Licks making salt for the garrison at the fort. He was kept as a prisoner of war by the Indians for over 5 years. He was carried to Chillicothe towns, then high up said river, then to Pickaway towns and many other places on Big Miami, to their towns and then to Detroit. He was sold by the Indians to the British before his discharge, and was finally discharged on the shores of Lake Erie, place not recollected. James Calloway was one of the saltmakers taken by the Shawnee to Detroit. It appears that Calloway had a very bad temper, which got him into trouble first with the Indians and then with the British. Calloway's pension record file contains the following narrative. He remained stationed at Boonesborough under Colonel Boone until about the 1st of January, 1778, when he was detailed among others to proceed to the Blue Licks and make salt for provisions of the garrison. Here he remained employed until about the 8th of February following, when the whole party with whom he was with were taken, himself among the number by a party of Indians, and then taken to their towns in Ohio. There, after remaining several days in consultation, it was at last determined to send a portion of the prisoners, himself among the number, to Detroit, which they reached in May. Here he understood that he was purchased by the British Governor Hamilton, and remained until November following without having much to do, except attend roll call every Sunday morning. About this time he was employed by a resident merchant to go on service for him some distance, and being about to depart was required before leaving to take an oath of fidelity to his then Majesty King George III. This he peremptorily refused to do, and was thereupon instantly put into prison and confined 14 or 15 days, when he was taken out and sent under guard and in irons to Fort Niagara, where he remained in irons and guarded for about 2 weeks, and was thence placed on board a ship, and transported to Buck Island. There he was placed on board a boat and sent to Montreal, where he remained for about 2 weeks. He was then placed on board a sloop tied hand and foot and sent to Quebec, where he was put in jail. He was kept there something like 2 years when he was taken out and sent to St. Paul's Bay, which he reached in October or November in the year 1780. He remained here a prisoner for about 12 months, when he was placed on board a ship and sent round to New York. He was not landed, however, but transferred to a cartel, and transported up the North River to Dobbs Ferry, where he was either exchanged or paroled, he cannot say which, the only paper he received being a permit from an American officer to go home or wheresoever he pleased. He then returned home to Bedford County, Virginia. Also in James Calloway's file can be found details on an unsuccessful escape from Quebec, as related by Calloway's 2 sons. When they had been there for about 2 years, 9 of their number, including himself, made their escape, and approaching a small lake near Quebec, where they found no means of crossing, they had to lay in ambush that day. A little before night they saw a man passing, and being afraid that he would see them and make it known, they laid hold on him. They, however, released him, he having promised to bring them some provisions, and also to tell them where they could get a canoe. The man brought them some provisions and told them where they could find the canoe. They went at night and found the canoe and crossed the lake. When they got across, they were out of provisions, and on account of their being so near starved, 6 of their number went back and gave themselves up to the British, and told where the remaining 3 were. Calloway and the other 2 that remained at the lake were there engaged in catching fish and frogs and drying them for some time, they think for about 30 days. They were drying the fish and frogs for a subsistence on their journey, but before they left the lake, 5 Indians and 1 Frenchman who were in pursuit of them came upon them and arrested them, and took them back to Quebec. Another prisoner, Richard Wade, was not only kept by the British at Detroit, but was imprisoned elsewhere in Canada. From Wade's pension records comes the following account. We were taken to the Indian towns on the Miami River. Some of the prisoners were taken to Detroit soon afterwards, but John Brown and myself remained until after they were done planting corn. We were then taken to Detroit and given or sold to the British. We remained at Detroit until the next summer, when 7 of us escaped and started home. A few miles above where the little river St. Joseph and St. Mary's meet, we were taken by the Maumee Indians and carried back to Detroit. We were then put in irons on board a ship and sent down to Montreal, where we were kept in prison. Then in July of 1781, 6 of us, to wit, John Brown, John Morton, and myself from Virginia, and James Flack, George Finley, and William Marshall of Pennsylvania, were taken out of prison to work on a mill race. From here we escaped, and after 9 days traveling through the wilderness, we came to the headwaters of the Connecticut River, to a station commanded by Captain Lovell. He sent a guard with us the next day 18 miles to General Bailey, who gave us a pass to the governor, John Hancock, at Boston. On our arrival there, the governor gave us a pass with orders to draw provisions homewards. We proceeded as far as Carlisle in Pennsylvania, where Brown and Morton went on to Virginia, the Pennsylvanians to their homes, and I to Fort Pitt to get a passage down the river. I arrived at the falls of the Ohio River about 3 weeks before Christmas in 1781, and there gave my pass to General George Rogers Clark, and then returned to Boonesborough. Another salt maker, William Hancock, was one of the first to escape, but not being an expert woodsman like Daniel Boone, he got completely lost in the woods. Weak and hungered, he sat down in despair, ready to die. Then he noticed a couple of chunks of wood near each other in a position which reminded him of a sudden that the spot was where he had formerly camped when out hunting. Now knowing his whereabouts, he bent his course for Boonesborough without difficulty. Benjamin Kelly escaped when Girty was attacking Wheeling in September of 1782. Samuel Brooks, who had been taken to the British at Detroit, attempted to run away. He was then retaken, put in confinement, and there he died. George Hendricks escaped from the Indians as related in Ansel Goodman's account, but was retaken by a band of Wyandots returning from the siege of Boonesborough. He was taken to the Wyandot town on the Sandusky River and held there for the better part of 19 months. In April of 1780, Hendricks again escaped from the Indians, and this time he made it back to Kentucky. John Hawley was rescued when George Rogers Clark's men attacked the Shawnee settlement of McKeestown in November of 1782. Hawley had tied his horse and was rummaging in a cabin, some Indians in his company, when whites came in sight. The Indians with him dashed off, and he, pretending to be bothered in untying his horse, thus delayed until the whites came up and rescued him. So this article provided some interesting accounts of the captured salt makers. James and Micajah Calloway were brothers. James was the ill-tempered one who was sold to the British. This footnote tells of an incident that may have led the Shawnees to sell James to the British instead of adopting him into their tribe. James Calloway almost did not make it to the Indian towns in Ohio. From the Draper manuscript collection come details of the following incident. On the morning after the capture, an Indian who had been carrying along one of the salt kettles told Calloway to carry it. He said he would not. The Indian still insisting and Calloway still obstinate, the Indian finally drew his tomahawk and raised it. Calloway bent forward to receive the blow, at the same time taking off his hat and patting the top of his head with his hand, saying, "Here, strike! I would as like to lie here as go along. I won't tote your kettle." The Indian, with a dry smile, turned away, put up his tomahawk, and carried the kettle himself. The Calloway brothers' uncle was Colonel Richard Calloway. In another footnote in this paper, it says that when Daniel Boone returned to Boonesborough, Calloway accused Boone of betraying the salt makers to the Indians and demanded a trial by court-martial. There were a total of 4 court-martial charges brought by Colonel Calloway. Uncertain as to why he would turn against an old friend, some historians have portrayed Calloway as an ill-natured, suspicious man who acted out of jealousy towards Boone. But when it is understood that 2 of the captured salt makers were Calloway's nephews, a new light is cast on the subject. It appears that Colonel Calloway had a very strong personal reason for wanting Boone's conviction. This other article on the website revolutionarywar.us gives some more information on the charges that were brought against Daniel Boone following the siege of Boonesborough. Colonel Richard Calloway brought charges against Boone, alleging that Boone was in favor of the British government. Joining Calloway was Captain Benjamin Logan from nearby Logan Station. Logan and Calloway both had nephews who had been surrendered by Boone at the Salt Licks and were still prisoners. In the court-martial proceedings held at Logan's Fort, there were 4 charges brought against Boone. First, that Boone had surrendered the salt-making party without a fight. Second, while in captivity, Boone had promised to surrender Boonesborough to the British. Third, after his return, he had led the Paint Lick expedition, which weakened Boonesborough at a time when Blackfish's army was expected. Fourth, Boone had exposed the officers to ambush by agreeing to meet the Indians at the peace treaty outside the fort. After listening to all the testimony, the court found Boone not guilty, and even promoted him to major because of his actions. Despite this vindication, Boone was humiliated by the episode. Boone then went to North Carolina to retrieve his family, who had returned there during his captivity, believing him to be dead. When Boone came back to Kentucky, he established a new settlement called Boone's Station, rather than resettle in the place where he had been court-martialed. While Boone was in North Carolina, a retaliatory raid was launched against Blackfish's town of Chillicothe in the spring of 1779. Blackfish successfully defended his village, but was shot in the leg and later died when the wound became infected. On March 8, 1780, Callaway was caught outside Boonesborough by Shawnees. He was killed, scalped, and mutilated. So that's it for this episode. This is actually the third episode I have done on Daniel Boone. I haven't done one in a while, but you can check out these two older videos for a few more stories about Daniel Boone and his first trips into Kentucky. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is unworthy of being shown on history channels on TV. Stay tuned to this channel for more history about people who lived much harder lives than we have to, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.